Welcome to the Level 3 Team Leader Supervisor session, which is aimed around the trends identified from the Team Leader Level 3 endpoint assessment with Pearson. As part of the session, we will be looking at the trends that have been identified for the presentation and professional discussion underpinned by the portfolio of evidence. As well as looking at these trends, we'll also be discussing the resources that are available. So first of all, we're going to look at the resources that are available. Now, if you are an apprentice watching this recording, you will need to reach out to your training provider to obtain copies of these resources, as they are located on our A360 system, which you do not have access to. If you are a training provider accessing the resources, please log into the apprentice's account and you will identify a magnifying glass, which you can select, and this will bring up the relevant documentation relating to the team leader standard, as well as some generic resources. So on my slide, you'll see a screenshot of the presentation, knowledge, skills and behaviours groupings. Now, this is just one section from the component, which provides key information around the areas to be covered within the component. So you'll see that the screenshot is relating to the team building and development section, and it provides further information around the knowledge, skills and behaviours and what is considered as a pass and what is required for the distinction criteria. Now, this is just a screenshot of one section, and within the documentation, it will provide information around all components within the presentation and also within the professional discussion. These resources are really important and should be utilised to support the apprentice in preparing for their endpoint assessment. Within the resources section, there are a range of documents that can be accessed, including the EPA, which is where the screenshot is taken from, as well as other resources such as a frequently asked questions, the declarations that need to be submitted, and other aspects such as a checklist, which I will show you on my next screen. So on this slide here, this is a screenshot of a checklist that you and the apprentice can use to check that you have everything that you require for your endpoint assessment and for submission. So the one on screen is relating to the professional discussion, which is underpinned by the portfolio of evidence. So as you can see, it asks things such as if the portfolio log document has been completed and referenced. And again, you can find the portfolio log document on the A360 within the resource section. It also gives some hints and tips, such as practicing prior to the actual endpoint assessment to support and develop any areas that may be required. So now we're going to look at the presentation component. So we're going to look at the trends in relating to the presentation that we are coming through in terms of assessments at Pearson. Now, to give an overview of this component, the apprentice is assigned a project title, and that will be one out of the 4 titles, which can be located in our resource pack and also the endpoint assessment plan. The apprentice has up to 2 weeks in which to put their presentation together and submit that to Pearson. This will then be reviewed by the IEA, not to assess, but to identify that the apprentice has applied and confirmed to the rules, and that to identify any questions that they may need to pose during the assessment component. On the day of the assessment, the apprentice will have up to 20 minutes to present their information, and then the remaining 30 minutes will be used by the IEA to pose further questions to them. So when I refer to IEA, we do refer to our independent endpoint assessors as IEAs at Pearson. Now, the aim of the questioning element from the IEA is to address any gaps that the apprentice has not covered through that presentation, or to clarify information. So, for example, if keywords have been stated, such as a theory, but there's no detail behind that, the IEA will explore that in further detail. The apprentice is permitted to have a 10% tolerance for this component, so it is a maximum of 55 minutes in total for the component. Now, that tolerance can be applied as the IEA sees fit, so either to the presentation or to the question and answers. So on my screen here, I've got an example of a slide that I've created of some of the trends that we are seeing coming through for the presentation component. So as previously mentioned, the presentation that is submitted by the apprentice is not assessed by the IEA. So they will not read and award any criteria based on the contents of the slide deck. On the day of the assessment, the apprentice will present their information. And again, it will only be the verbal information that the apprentice provides that will be assessed. So sometimes what we are seeing is that the apprentice will say, as you can see in my slide, and will then not expand. And although there may be information in the slide that could support and address criteria, because they're not verbalizing that information, unfortunately, we're unable to award, and this can then lead to questioning or even potential failures within the assessment. When the apprentice is allocated a project title, an email is issued to them and training providers are copied in, and this provides key information such as the rules around what is and is not permitted within the presentation. This also provides key information such as the deadline date for submission and actions that you as the apprentice needs to take. So for example, you need to forward this to your training provider to allow them to upload this to our A360 system within that 2-week deadline. Now, with the submissions, we are seeing lots of scripts within and under the slides, which are not permitted. So as you can see, this is an example of a slide which does contain script. And at Pearson, we do not allow this, as reading from a script does not show that as an apprentice, you have the knowledge and understanding around the information that's being read from. Now, notes are permitted in the slide and underneath, but these should be more prompts and bulleted rather than a script. If a script is provided within the slides, you will be contacted by the IEA to advise that the assessment will be unable to move forward until the slides have been amended. Now, if this falls outside of the 2-week deadline, you will not be permitted to add anything to the information, whether that is within the slides or underneath, or a separate document if you are using a separate document for your notes. You will only be able to reduce the information. In terms of your notes, they can be underneath the slides or they can be in a separate document, but they must be submitted within that 2-week deadline. We have had occasions where apprentices have come on the assessment day with extra notes or notes that have not been provided by the deadline, and unfortunately, these cannot be used within the assessment. So as I've mentioned, if the slides don't comply, it could lead to the IEA having to reach out, and it could result in the assessment date being postponed, and in some cases, a new project title being assigned. So as I mentioned on my screen is an example that we would be unable to accept and would lead to you having to edit and adapt that to reduce it down to comply with Pearson requirements. On the next screen, I have an example of a slide that would be accepted. So as you can see here, it still relates to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We have the image and then just some bullet points that as myself, if I was an apprentice, would maybe want to talk around within that presentation, depending on the areas that I'm looking to cover. Again, when putting your presentation together, please utilise the resource documents that Pearson provide that show you a breakdown of the areas to be covered within the presentation and questioning component. And again, it will give you the pass and distinction areas. We are sometimes seeing that presentations are going on for quite a while, but unfortunately, the information that's being provided is a little limited. So again, that is leading to further questions, which is impacting on the time. So on my slide here, you will see again that this is a script that you could read from word to word. So again, this will not be accepted within your submission. As I mentioned, timings can be quite tight, as in order to achieve the component, all pass criteria need to be achieved, and to achieve a distinction, all pass and all distinction criteria need to be achieved. So as you can see, as I've mentioned, this is a script within this slide which would not be permitted, but we are also seeing a lot of slides like this that give an introduction and background to the apprentice and their career history. So for example, within my slide, it refers to me working for an organisation for 15 years and wanting to progress to become a team leader, and how many interviews I have had. In terms of the assessment, this will not support any criteria, and we are finding that these introductions can be quite lengthy and are not covering any criteria, which leaves a lot to cover within the question and answer section. Although it may be nice for the IEA to hear a little bit of background, it is not always necessary. So please consider that when putting your presentations together. Is the information relevant? And again, by utilising those resources that provide the information around the pass and distinction criteria, you can identify if it would be suitable to include information such as this. Preparation is key, and as mentioned, those resources are really important to help and assist you in achieving the best possible outcome for the endpoint assessment and the presentation. Once you're presented to the IEA, you will have a 10-minute break to regroup, and that will allow the IEA to identify questions that they want to pose. As I've mentioned, we have had several incidences where apprentices have presented for 20 minutes and unfortunately they have achieved no criteria or very limited criteria, which then leaves several areas to be questioned, and this has resulted in only passes being achieved or even failures in some instances due to the maximum time being reached. So on the next slide here, this is just an example of templates. So we are seeing some templates coming through from apprentices that work in the same organisation or have the same training provider. Templates should not be issued or used, and it is really important to ensure that it is your own work being provided. So for example, we have seen templates where images are exactly the same and pretty much the context of them is also the same, with maybe the odd word only being changed or words have been exactly the same. We have had incidences where we have had to refer submissions to malpractice for them to be investigated and the appropriate action to be taken. If malpractice is identified, it will be referred, and this could result in the assessment being cancelled, or it could also result in the assessment being classed as a fail. It will be investigated by our malpractice team. So please ensure that you create your own slide deck with your own information that you want to get across during that presentation. As part of your submission, you are required to sign a declaration as well as a trainer to confirm that it is your own work that is being submitted. So, as mentioned, please try and avoid using any templates and create your own document from scratch. So, some key aspects relating to the presentation and question and answers. So as I mentioned, timing can be an issue, and sometimes we have seen this impacted when responses are limited or generic, or sometimes the context of we is applied. Due to the amount of areas that need to be covered, this can be challenging with the time that is provided, especially if nothing has been achieved or limited areas have been achieved through the presentation. So practice is really key to getting used to delivering confident and direct responses to questions posed and in relation to your presentation to make sure you get as much detail out within that 20 minutes as possible. As I've discussed, all areas do need to be covered to pass, and it is important that you are exposed to all areas of the standard throughout your apprenticeship, as you will need to address all areas within the endpoint assessment. So, for example, we do get a lot of questions asking, do I have to cover finance as it's not part of my role, or I haven't done this as part of my apprenticeship? You do need to do this, and unfortunately, if you can't provide sufficient information and examples, the outcome will be a fail. Only verbal information is considered. So again, please ensure that when you are practicing or that you're prepping for your presentation, that you get out that key information within your verbal responses. As although the slide may contain the information, we are unable to read and award marks based on this. Utilise those resources that are available from AC360 and use the checklist to check that you have got everything that you need to submit. Refer back to the email that provides key information around your presentation submission, such as the title that has been provided, the deadline date, and the rules around scripts and notes. Context of responses is another key area that we see in terms of responses are sometimes around what you would do or what we do. Now, as mentioned, you do need to give examples of when you have undertaken these activities to show your skills and application of these. So unfortunately, if you do talk around what you would do, this would not achieve the criteria. So again, ensure that you have been sufficiently exposed to all of these areas prior to going through Gateway for your endpoint assessment. Again, using the context way does not give the IA a clear indication of what your role or actions were within that example. Now, although the IA can pose follow-up questions, we do find that this does impact on time and again, can on occasion result in failures or only passes being achieved due to the time constraints of the component. We're now going to move on to the professional discussion. So the professional discussion is underpinned by a portfolio of evidence, which is submitted by you, the apprentice, at Gateway. This is uploaded to our systems by the training provider, and this will be reused and reviewed by the IEA to identify questions that they wish to pose during the component. We are going to be looking at key trends in terms of the professional discussion and what we are seeing within this assessment component. For the professional discussion, this is a maximum time of 60 minutes, and there is no tolerance for this component. The only thing the IA can allow you as the apprentice to do is to finish the response if you are still speaking at the 60-minute mark. They are not able to pose any further questions and add on 10% to do so. So again, this can be quite a challenge in terms of timing. So first of all, I want to look at the portfolio of evidence. So as mentioned, the portfolio is submitted along with a mapping document, and that is used by the IEA to identify and tailor questions to put to you during the professional discussion. Please note the portfolio of evidence is not assessed. So the IEA is not looking at information within that and awarding any marks to you as part of your assessment. So during the discussion, we are sometimes seeing that where apprentices will say, it's in my portfolio, or as you've seen in my portfolio, and then don't give sufficient detail in relation to the example. Again, although the IE may have seen this in the portfolio, they can't award the mark from that. It does need to be verbalised and sufficient information and detail provided. As a result, again, this does lead to follow-up questions being provided, and this again can impact on time. So the more detail and direct you can be with the sponsors, hopefully the more areas you are going to cover. And again, by getting that information out straight away rather than it's in my portfolio, again, will hopefully reduce the impact on time. Now on my slide, there's a screenshot, again, from the resources on ACE360 in relation to professional discussion and the portfolio. So this is a list of examples of evidence that can be used within that portfolio that is submitted. This is not a definitive list, it's just a guide to give you some ideas of what you may want to put forward. Again, please refer to the e-part within the resources, which will give a breakdown of professional discussion and the areas and criteria that fall within that and what is classed as a pass and a distinction. Because again, to achieve this component, you do need to achieve all the pass criteria, and to achieve the distinction, you need to achieve all the pass and distinction criteria. Now, within the portfolio, self-reflection is not permitted as documented in the assessment plan for the team leader supervisor standard. We are seeing a lot of this coming through within portfolios, and this does impact. So on my slide here, you will see there is a reflective account in relation to a project and Gantt chart that's been used. Now, we are seeing a lot of this within the portfolios, and unfortunately, as self-reflection is not permitted as per the assessment plan, it does mean that the IEA is not able to consider this to tailor their questions to the apprentice for the professional discussion. It doesn't mean that the apprentice is going to fail, as the portfolio is not assessed, but it does limit the amount of questions that we can personalise to the apprentice and the information that's been given within that portfolio of evidence. On my next slide is an example of what could be put forward, and we have seen some of this, which is working very well. So product evidence can be provided, such as the Gantt chart on the screen, and annotation can be provided to give some information on what this is. So for example, on my slide here, it states Gantt chart used on data system project. This would then allow the IEA to tailor the question within the project area to that data system project. So rather than giving a question of, can you give me an example of when you've undertaken a project and the project management tools you have used, the IEA could say, I've seen in your portfolio, you've made reference to a data system project with an image of a Gantt chart. How do you relate to this project and how did you use that Gantt chart? This just tailors and personalises the questions a little bit more for the apprentice to hope to provide that light bulb moment and for them to give those detailed examples. We have seen a lot of instances where portfolios are coming in and they are all nearly self-reflection, which has resulted in minimal or no questions being personalised. So before submitting your portfolio, please think about the contents and whether this will allow us to personalise the questions to you. So on my screen here, there is an image of the portfolio mapping document, which also gives the breakdown of the grade descriptors for pass and distinction, and again, the knowledge, skills and behaviour groups that this relates to. So this can be found as a separate document and also within the EPA. And as you can see from my screen, this one relates to building a high-performing team. You are required to reference your evidence, and this needs to be submitted with the portfolio and declaration at the time of Gateway submission. We are seeing instances where portfolios are being submitted with masses of evidence, and evidence is being embedded within documents. This does sometimes cause issues in that documents embedded will not always open and display for the IEA. And also we are seeing that masses of documents are being provided and are not always relevant. And we are seeing this impact in the professional discussion, with apprentices being confused due to the amount of evidence within their portfolio when trying to navigate this. Another trend we have also seen is apprentices being unfamiliar with what has been submitted in that portfolio. It's really important that the apprentice is selecting key pieces of evidence and putting these forward and is familiar with that portfolio of evidence. So should they need to refer to it during the professional discussion, they can locate the information easily and quickly. We do undertake holistic assessment at Pearson with our endpoint assessments. So we do encourage and ask apprentices to do the same when submitting evidence within their portfolio. We are having instances where apprentices are submitting the same piece of evidence maybe 10, 15 or 20 times and referencing this to individual criteria that they feel this links to. If you do feel the piece of evidence covers more than one criteria, you only need to provide the document once and just reference whatever title is being used against the relevant knowledge, skills and behaviours within the mapping document. Please don't provide the document 5, 6, 10 or 15 times, as this does cause issues when downloading the portfolio. And again, can cause confusion during the assessment for the apprentice. We're also seeing recordings submitted within the portfolio, and although these are permitted, again, we have seen trends where apprentices are wanting to access these during the assessment to refresh themselves. and this is impacted as the time doesn't stop while apprentices are trying to access and navigate evidence within their portfolio. We have seen recordings that will not download for them, or they are not sure what's in the recording or where to locate the relevant information that they need within those. So although recordings can be used, please consider if these would impact on you as the apprentice during your assessment. So are you going to be able to download them in timely and access the information you need quickly? Or would this be better in a written format? Navigation of portfolio of evidence, again, is another area that we are seeing. So apprentices can access their portfolio during the assessment, and this can be paper-based or online. The apprentice will need to share their screen if accessing the portfolio online, so the IEA is confident what they are viewing during the assessment for audit purposes. We have seen apprentices navigating online platforms but are not familiar with them, and again this has impacted on their time and has caused them to become flustered and has resulted in failures as they have become heavily concentrated on accessing the evidence rather than listening and addressing the question. So again, as part of your preparation, please ensure that you can navigate your portfolio quickly and confidently. Portfolio can be paper-based. The IEA will just check that it is that you have during the assessment, and you can have a copy of the mapping document with you. Again, we have sometimes seen additional notes written on the mapping document, and this would not be permitted, and mapping document has had to be removed for this reason. Only information and evidence submitted within the portfolio at Gateway can be used. Additional notes or extras within the portfolio are not permitted within the assessment. If having paper-based portfolios, please ensure that you use the same referencing that's been applied when submitting your electric one to Pearson. Sometimes we have seen that referencing has changed, and again, this can lead to confusion during questioning. We have seen some good practice in terms of navigation of portfolios, with some apprentices placing sticky notes, colour-coded sticky notes, to break up the different sections and information. This is permitted as long as there are no additional notes written on the sticky notes. We have seen that apprentices that have key pieces of evidence, so less is more, have a success when navigating and using this as part of their assessment. So within the professional discussion and the presentation and Q&A component, the apprentice can bring in a pen and paper to note down any questions that we pose as IEAs, but at the end they will be asked to destroy these whilst on camera. It is important that the apprentice comes prepared, so they should be attending with their portfolio of evidence. They may not need to refer to this during the professional discussion, but it is important that they have it in case they do need to refer back to something. So again, this can be paper-based or it can be electronic, but the screen would have to be shared. In terms of the pen and paper, that has to be blank when brought into the assessment, and they can note down questions, but as mentioned, that it would have to be destroyed at the end of the assessment. So again, it is better to bring the pen and paper and not need it, rather than need this mid-assessment, as they will not be permitted to leave the assessment to obtain these items. So some key aspects relating to the professional discussion. So as mentioned, it is 60 minutes with no tolerance, so timing is key, and practice. So practicing navigating that portfolio to locate the information quickly and confidently to be able to address the questions posed by the IEA. Given those detailed examples, sometimes we are seeing that apprentices go around the houses to get to the information that is needed. So again, given those detailed direct responses to the IEA. All areas need to be covered to achieve the pass, and all pass and distinction criteria need to be covered to achieve the distinction. So hopefully by putting in strong pieces of evidence that will allow more questions to be tailored, which will give the apprentice that more personal feel to get those examples out and hopefully achieve that distinction criteria. Only verbal information is considered. So again, although there may be something in the portfolio that would support, the apprentice does need to verbalise the response, and this is the only element that is being assessed. Preparation, so again, utilising those resources such as the mapping grid and EPARP to identify and ensure that they are confident in giving examples to the areas that are required. And again, ensuring that they have been exposed to all of these areas during the apprenticeship period, as we're not able to accept what the apprentice would do, or them to say, I don't do that as part of my job role, which we have seen on several occasions in relation to areas such as project management and finance. So again, as it is a past requirement, unfortunately, would result in a fail. The portfolio, so again, ensuring that there's not reams and reams of evidence in there, that as the apprentice can navigate this confidently and quickly, and that they can open the documents easily and download them if it is on screen. So again, it's not impacting on time, because the time does not stop if the apprentice needs to access any of this information during the assessment. So again, recordings can be impactful in terms of time. Again, the context of responses. So making sure that you get your responses out about what you do and not what we do, to ensure that the IEA is given a clear indication. And by doing that, hopefully it will result in less questions being posed, which will lead more time to try and cover those distinction areas. So a recap of the session. So please ensure you have access to all of the relevant resources which are located on ACE 360. If you are an apprentice watching the video, please reach out to your training provider to obtain copies of the resources. So these include things such as the EPARP, frequently asked questions, mapping documents, and declarations. Please practice, practice, practice. So when you come forward for EL endpoint assessment, you feel confident and ready to go and give those detailed responses, which will hopefully lead to a distinction outcome. Utilise the resources available. So when selecting your evidence for your portfolio, utilise the EPARP, which shows you the criteria that falls within the professional discussion. Think about the examples that you are going to use within the professional discussion and practice these with your training provider. When allocated your project title, again, utilise the resources such as EPARP to see the areas that fall within that component, and again, the areas that you need to cover through the presentation and question and answers. The more you can cover within that 20 minutes, hopefully the less questions you will have posed and the more chance you'll stand of coming out with the distinction criteria. So again, by putting those key aspects in your presentation, this will hopefully make life a little bit easier for you. Work smart. So for example, give key pieces of evidence. For example, if that is 10 key pieces, is that better than 100 pieces, which maybe only show small snippets of information? And again, remember, reflective accounts cannot be used, so they will not be considered when tailoring questions for you in the professional discussion. You do need to demonstrate all knowledge, skills and behaviours as a minimum to the past requirement. So again, before coming into the assessment, review over the EPARP and see if there are any areas that you feel you have not been exposed to or that you require further support and training from your training provider from. As unfortunately, if you provide the response that you don't do something, that will result in the outcome being a fail, as you do need to demonstrate your knowledge, skills and behaviours. So look at those areas and put a plan in place if needed to try and get more exposure before coming into endpoint assessment. I'd like to thank you for your time for watching the video. I hope it's been useful, and I'd like to wish those apprentices moving forward to endpoint assessment all the best and good luck.